He had spent decades climbing the ranks of the Seoul underworld with one rule he never broke: never show mercy to an enemy's blood. But on a storm-soaked mountain road, when a Mafia boss saw two girls huddled in the rain, one look at a terrified child made him slam the brakes, and that single decision changed every life involved forever. On a forgotten road through the mountains, during a brutal midnight storm, a hardened criminal faced a choice between cold-blooded duty and a flickering sense of honor. What began as a risky act of mercy toward the daughters of his greatest rival would ignite a violent power struggle, uncover deep-seated grief, and lead to an unexpected new beginning for them all. This is a story about hitting the brakes when it's easier to keep driving, and how sometimes the innocent lives we protect end up protecting us from our own darkness. The storm wasn't just rain, it was a black, suffocating shroud that seemed determined to swallow the winding mountain pass whole. Park Do-yeon sat behind the wheel of his black sedan, his silhouette as rigid and unyielding as the reinforced steel frame of the vehicle. For 20 years, the underworld had been his only home, a place where survival was dictated by a single ironclad rule: never stop for anyone. In his world, a figure on the side of the road wasn't a person in need, it was a target, a witness, or a trap. His calloused fingers, scarred from decades of enforcing the syndicate's will, drummed a restless rhythm against the leather steering wheel. The rhythmic, aggressive slap of the wipers against the glass was the only sound besides the low, guttural hum of the engine. He was tired. Not the kind of fatigue that sleep could fix, but a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that came from seeing too much blood and too little light. Suddenly, the powerful xenon headlights pierced the gloom, illuminating two figures huddled on the muddy shoulder. Do-yeon's foot hovered over the brake out of pure habit, but his mind immediately revolted. "Keep driving," his instinct hissed. "It's a setup, or worse, it's a distraction." He began to press the accelerator, the engine roaring in response, ready to leave the silhouettes to the mercy of the mountain. But as the car drew closer, the light caught the pale, trembling face of a teenage girl. She wasn't just standing there, she was a shield. Her slim frame was bent forward, one arm wrapped tightly around a smaller child who was clutching a worn, soaked bag as if it held the last of their lives. Do-yeon's gaze hardened. He recognized the shape of that jawline, the defiant yet terrified set of the girl's eyes. This wasn't a random encounter. That was Han Ji-woo, the eldest daughter of Han Tae-shik, the man whose name was currently written on a contract sitting in Do-yeon's pocket. His logic was a cold, efficient machine. If he kept driving, nature would do the syndicate's work for him. Exposure and the mountain would erase his problems without a single bullet being fired. But then the younger girl looked directly into the glare of his headlights. Her eyes were wide, glassed over with a level of absolute terror that bypassed Do-yeon's defensive logic and struck a chord he thought had been severed years ago. It was the same look his own daughter had given him before the shadows took her. The internal battle lasted only a heartbeat, but it felt like an eternity. His veteran hitman instinct screamed at him to vanish into the night, but a long-buried spark of honor, or perhaps a sudden, violent surge of guilt, took control. With a sharp exhale that sounded like a groan of resignation, Do-yeon slammed on the brakes. The tires shrieked against the wet asphalt, the car fishtailing slightly before coming to a dead stop just yards past the shivering pair. The high-pitched hiss of the brakes faded, leaving only the sound of the rain. Do-yeon sat in the silence, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached over and unlocked the passenger door. He didn't look back, he just stared into the darkness of the road ahead, his voice raspy and cold. "Get in," he commanded, the words feeling heavy in the air, "before the mountain changes its mind." The heavy door of the sedan groaned as it swung open, acting as a brief shield against the driving rain. Han Ji-woo didn't hesitate. She ushered her younger sister, Min-ah, into the plush leather interior first, her movements frantic and protective. As Ji-woo climbed in behind her, the sudden warmth of the cabin hit them like a physical wave, smelling of expensive tobacco and the sharp, clean scent of cedar. Do-yeon remained motionless, his hands still fused to the steering wheel at the 9 and 3 positions, his gaze fixed straight ahead into the gray void of the storm. He didn't speak as they buckled themselves in, their soaked clothes immediately darkening the pristine upholstery. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of the girls and the dripping of water onto the floorboards. Diane sifted the car into gear and pulled away slowly, the tires finding purchase on the slick asphalt. For the first few miles, the silence inside the car was more suffocating than the storm outside. Diane's eyes flickered upward, landing on the side view mirror. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, he could see Ji-woo's reflection. She wasn't looking at him, she was staring out the window, but her hand was gripped so tightly around her sister's shoulder that her knuckles were ghost white. Through that small rectangle of glass, Diane saw the reality of his decision. He saw the salt trails of dried tears on Minna's cheeks, and the way Ji-woo's lower lip trembled, not just from the cold, but from the sheer crushing weight of responsibility. She looked like a child trying to play the part of a soldier, a role Diane knew all too well. He looked away, his jaw tightening. He knew who their father was. He knew that by having them in this car, he was effectively holding the ultimate leverage in a war that had already claimed too many lives. His phone, sitting in the center console, felt like a live grenade. A single call to the Syndicate would end the conflict by morning. He could deliver them to the main villa, collect his reward, and finally earn the peace the bosses had promised him. Yet, as he glanced at the mirror again, he caught Ji-woo looking back. For a split second, their eyes met in the reflection. There was no defiance left in her gaze, only a hollow, haunting desperation. The look of someone who had reached the end of the world and found no one there to catch them. She wasn't an enemy asset. She was a girl whose world had been set on fire by men like him. A sudden, violent memory of his own daughter's laughter echoed in the back of his mind, followed by the cold, silent vacuum of her absence. The defensive logic he had built his life upon began to crumble. He realized then that he wasn't just looking at his enemy's children, he was looking at the physical manifestation of his own failures. The car reached a fork in the road. To the left lay the city and the Syndicate's cold embrace. To the right was the long, winding path toward the coast and the old estate he hadn't visited in years. Do-yoon's hand moved to the blinker. The rhythmic click, click, click filled the cabin, marking a point of no return. He turned the wheel to the right, choosing the long road, and for the first time in a decade, the man who lived by the rules of the dead felt the terrifying heat of a living conscience. The sedan carved a lonely path through the deluge, the interior cabin transformed into a pressurized chamber of secrets. For miles, the only sounds were the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal and the soft, rhythmic snoring of little Minna, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion against her sister's side. Park Do-yoon kept his eyes on the road, but his peripheral vision remained locked on the teenage girl beside him. She was shivering, her wet hair plastered to her forehead, staring at the dashboard as if it were a ticking bomb. "The mountain road is closed to the north," Do-yoon finally said, his voice gravelly and low, breaking the silence like a gunshot. "You wouldn't have made it another hour out there." Ji-woo didn't look at him. She tightened her grip on her sister's hand. "We weren't looking for a way out," Ji-woo whispered, her voice cracking with a fatigue that sounded decades older than her years. "We were just looking for a place where the shadows didn't have eyes." Do-yoon felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. He knew exactly which shadows she meant. He reached into the door pocket and pulled out a clean, dry towel, tossing it onto her lap without a word. She flinched at the movement, then slowly began to pat her sister's face dry. "He's gone, isn't he?" Do-yoon asked. It wasn't a question of curiosity, but a confirmation of the underworld's balance of power. Ji-woo's hands stopped moving. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the weight of the truth. "They came for him 3 nights ago," she said, her voice a hollow monotone. "My father told us to run to the old storage docks if the lights ever went out. He said you, men like you, wouldn't care about the collateral damage." She finally turned her head, her dark eyes reflecting the neon green glow of the instrument panel. "Is that why you stopped? To finish what they started?" Do-yoon gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. In the Syndicate, confession was a death sentence, but here, in the sanctuary of this moving metal box, the rules felt distant. "I stopped because I saw a ghost," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "A ghost of a man I used to be before I started counting bodies instead of blessings." The confession seemed to pull a thread in Jiwoo. She began to talk, not with the polished lies of a Mafia daughter, but with the frantic honesty of the condemned. She spoke of the late-night phone calls their father tried to hide, the suitcases always packed by the door, and the way Mina had stopped speaking the day the black vans first appeared outside their school. She told him that they weren't headed to an ally, they were simply walking until their legs gave out, because they had nowhere else to go. As the rain hammered against the roof, Do-yoon realized this wasn't just a car ride, it was a mobile confessional. Every secret she spilled was a weight transferred from her shoulders to his. He had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but the raw desperation in this girl's voice was acting like a flood, eroding his foundations. By the time the lights of a distant, lonely diner appeared through the mist, the Mafia boss wasn't thinking about the contract in his pocket anymore. He was thinking about how many miles were left until they reached a place where the rain couldn't reach them. The neon sign of the Last Mile Diner flickered through the deluge, a bleeding halo of red and amber against the pitch-black mountainside. It was a place for people who didn't want to be found, drivers running on illegal logs, and wanderers with nowhere left to go. Do-yoon pulled the sedan into the gravel lot, the stones crunching beneath his tires like breaking bone. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice a low vibration that commanded obedience. As they stepped out of the car, the wind tried to tear the breath from their lungs. Do-yoon moved with a practiced fluidity, placing his large, leather-clad frame between the wind and the girls, shielding them until they reached the heavy oak door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt grease, old coffee, and the metallic tang of a heating unit on its last legs. A few weary truckers glanced up from their booths, but one look at Do-yoon's stern, alert expression and the way he surveyed the room like a predator sent their eyes back down to their plates. He led them to a corner booth, the vinyl cracked and taped. Jiwoo slid in first, pulling Minna deep into the shadows of the high-backed seat. They were still shivering, their skin a ghostly blue under the harsh fluorescent lights. A waitress with tired eyes approached, but Do-yoon didn't wait for a menu. 3 bowls of beef stew, extra bread, hot tea, and black coffee, he said, dropping a crisp bill on the table. He didn't ask if they were hungry. He knew the hollow look in Jiwoo's eyes all too well. When the food arrived, steaming and rich, the silence of the table was broken only by the clinking of spoons. Do-yoon watched them from across the table, his own coffee untouched. He watched as Jiwoo instinctively pushed the largest chunks of meat toward her sister's bowl, her own movements slow and deliberate, as if she were trying to prove she wasn't as starving as she looked. It was the golden rule of his world, every man for himself, being broken right in front of him by a girl who had nothing left to give. "You eat too," Do-yoon said, his voice softer than before, though no less firm. Jiwoo paused, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, really looked at him, searching for the hidden catch in his charity. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "My father said you were the one who negotiated the territories. He said you were the one who made the world cold." Do-yoon leaned back, the shadows of the booth playing across the rugged lines of his face. "Your father wasn't wrong," he admitted, "but even the coldest winter has to end eventually." He looked at the younger girl, who was now clutching a warm piece of bread like a treasure. "The Syndicate has rules for business, but tonight I'm not on the clock." As the warmth of the meal began to return the color to their faces, Do-yoon realized he was committing the ultimate sin in his profession. He was becoming invested. He had broken his own rule of isolation. He had stopped for strangers, and now, sharing a meal in a god-forsaken diner, he felt the heavy mantle of the boss slipping, replaced by the terrifying, unfamiliar weight of a protector. He knew the Syndicate's eyes were everywhere, and the longer they sat here, the more the red neon light outside looked like a countdown.
The steam from the tea curled around Do-yoon's face as he watched the girls finish their meal. The diner was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of a refrigerator and the relentless lashing of rain against the window pane. He reached into his leather jacket, pulling out a small, encrypted tablet, the digital ledger of the syndicate. On the screen, a notification flickered. His own lieutenant was asking for a status update on the cleanup of the Han family. "Your father was a man of many secrets," Do-yoon said, his eyes not leaving the screen. "But he was also a man of meticulous records. He kept a ledger of every shipment that passed through the northern docks. That ledger is the only thing keeping the peace between 3 different factions right now. Without it, the city burns."
Ji-woo wiped her sister's face one last time before looking up. Her fear had been replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. She reached into her soaked backpack and pulled out a small, battered notebook, its edges stained with mud and seawater. "He didn't give it to his associates," she said, her voice steady, "and he didn't hide it in a vault. He gave it to me." She slid the notebook across the scarred vinyl table. "He told me that if anything happened, I should find someone who still remembered what an oath meant. He said most men in your world are vultures, but a few are still wolves, and wolves don't eat their own." Do-yoon opened the book. His breath hitched. It wasn't just a list of names and numbers. It was a complex cipher, hand-drawn with the precision of an architect. He recognized the symbols. They were part of an old maritime code used by the Busan clans decades ago, a language almost forgotten by the modern, tech-obsessed gangsters of the city. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "I know it's why my mother is dead," Ji-woo replied, her gaze unwavering. "And I know that my father spent his last night alive teaching me how to read the secondary layer. He said the numbers are a lie. The real truth is in the spacing of the characters." She leaned forward, pointing to a series of seemingly random dots between the lines. Under the harsh fluorescent light, she began to decode a string of coordinates that pointed not to a dock, but to a series of shell companies owned by Do-yoon's own ambitious lieutenant. It was the proof of a betrayal that reached into the very heart of Do-yoon's inner circle. In that moment, Do-yoon didn't see an enemy's daughter. He saw a girl who had been forged in the same fire as he had, a girl who carried her father's honor like a shield. She had been tested by the storm and by the loss of everything she knew, and yet she hadn't sold the secret to save herself. She had waited for a wolf. He closed the notebook and tucked it into his own pocket. The weight of it felt like a declaration of war. By taking it, he was no longer just a driver. He was an accomplice in a rebellion against his own kind. "You've proven your father was smarter than I gave him credit for," Do-yoon said, standing up and signaling for them to move. "And you've proven you're his daughter. But that notebook just made you the most dangerous person in Korea. We can't stay on the main roads anymore." As they hurried back to the car, Do-yoon didn't look at the map for the city. He looked toward the coast, toward the haven he had tried to forget. The test of merit was over. The test of survival was just beginning. The black sedans sped southward, the tires humming a low, mournful tune against the rain-slicked pavement. They were approaching the interchange, the nexus of Do-yoon's 2 lives. To the left, the neon sprawl of Seoul glowed like a radioactive bruise on the horizon. That way lay the Syndicate's headquarters, the safe return to the hierarchy, and the cold comfort of a job finished. To the right, the road narrowed into the darkness of the coast, toward a place he hadn't dared to visit in half a decade. His phone vibrated in the center console again. The name on the screen was Lieutenant Kang. The vibration felt like a heartbeat, insistent and demanding. Do-yoon looked at the exit signs as they flickered past, his mind a battlefield of cold logic and a newly awakened soul. If he took the left, he could hand over the notebook and the girls. He would be rewarded, he would be safe. The world would remain exactly as cold as it had always been. Ji-woo noticed his hesitation. She watched his hand hover near the turn signal, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't beg. She simply looked at the back of his head, her eyes reflecting the flickering highway lights. She knew that her life and the life of her sleeping sister rested entirely on which way he flicked a piece of plastic. "If you go back," Ji-woo said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You aren't just giving them us, you're giving them the only truth left in this world." Do-yun looked into the rearview mirror. He didn't see the boss of a criminal empire. He saw a man who was tired of being a ghost. He remembered the smell of the sea air at the Haven, the way his wife's laughter used to fill the sun-drenched porch of the small estate before the Syndicate's business had poisoned his life. He realized that the Haven wasn't just a property, it was a sanctuary he had abandoned when he decided to become a monster. The exit for the city loomed. The white arrows on the pavement seemed to point toward his inevitable fate. His thumb brushed the turn signal to the left, but then he saw Min-ah stir in her sleep, her small hand clutching the dry towel he had given her. It was a gesture of trust he didn't deserve. With a sudden, violent motion, Do-yun jerked the wheel to the right. The sedan lurched as it bypassed the exit for Seoul, tires screaming as they took the ramp toward the coast. He didn't just pass the exit, he severed the umbilical cord to his past. "Where are we going?" Ji-woo whispered, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to snap. "To a place forgotten by God," Do-yun replied, his voice firmer than it had been all night, "and hopefully forgotten by the Syndicate. It's called the Haven. It's a graveyard for things that refuse to die." He reached over and turned off his phone, plunging the cabin into a deep, heavy silence. By choosing the right turn, he had declared war on everyone he knew. But for the first time in 5 years, as the salt spray of the ocean began to mix with the mountain rain, Park Do-yun felt like he was finally driving home. The sedan's tires transitioned from smooth asphalt to the crunch of gravel and dead leaves as they turned into a long, overgrown driveway. Towering pines, heavy with rainwater, leaned over the car like ancient sentinels guarding a tomb. At the end of the path sat the Haven, a sprawling traditional estate that had once been a masterpiece of wood and stone, now grayed by neglect. The porch light flickered, struggling against the dampness, casting long, skeletal shadows across the peeling paint of the wraparound veranda. Do-yun killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the pinging of the cooling metal and the distant rhythmic roar of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below. He sat for a moment, his forehead resting against the steering wheel. This was the place where he had buried his life before the Syndicate had turned him into a ghost. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice a low rasp as he stepped out into the cold air. He led the girls onto the porch, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He reached into the frame of a decorative light fixture and pulled out a heavy brass key, untouched for 5 years. As the door swung open, the air that rushed out was stale, smelling of dust, dried lavender, and the lingering scent of a life that had ended too soon. Inside, the furniture stood like ghosts under white linen shrouds. Ji-woo stepped into the foyer, her eyes wide as she took in the high ceilings and the grand staircase. Even under a layer of dust, the house radiated a warmth that the Syndicate's glass and steel safe houses never could. Min-ah, still groggy from sleep, clutched the hem of Do-yun's leather jacket. Her eyes darted toward the dark corners. Do-yun walked to the fireplace and struck a match. The dry wood caught quickly, the orange glow beginning to chase away the shadows. As the light filled the room, it illuminated a large framed photograph on the mantel. In it, a younger, smiling Do-yun stood with his arm around a woman and a small girl. Their laughter seemed frozen in time, a sharp contrast to the grim, rain-soaked man standing before the hearth now. Ji-woo walked over to the photo, her gaze softening as she looked at the image of the man who wasn't a boss, but a father. "She looks like she was happy," she whispered. "She was," Do-yun replied, his back to her as he stoked the flames. "Before I brought the world outside into this house. I thought I could keep them separate. I was wrong." He turned to face them, the firelight carving deep lines into his rugged face. He realized that the Haven wasn't just a hiding spot, it was a vault of memories he had locked away to keep himself from feeling. But as Ji-woo and Min-ah huddled near the warmth, their presence began to stir the stagnant air of the house. The neglected estate was breathing again. He pointed toward the stairs. "The rooms at the end of the hall are clean. There's food in the pantry that hasn't expired, and plenty of wood for the stove." He looked at the heavy oak front door, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol holstered at his hip. "Sleep now.
Tomorrow, the world will come looking for us, and this house will have to remember how to be a fortress." As the girls climbed the stairs, Do-yun sat in a worn leather chair facing the door. He didn't close his eyes. He watched the shadows dance on the walls, listening to the house settle, knowing that he had finally stopped running, but the war was just beginning. The peace of the haven was shattered not by a scream, but by the low, predatory hum of multiple engines climbing the gravel drive. Inside the house, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the dusty floorboards. Do-hyun, who had been sitting in the darkness with his eyes fixed on the front door, felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. It was the sound of high-performance German engineering, the signature sound of the Syndicate's elite enforcement unit. He moved with a silent, lethal grace, crossing the room to the base of the stairs. "Ji-woo," he hissed into the shadows, "take your sister to the cellar. Do not come out unless I am the one who opens the door. Do you understand?" Ji-woo appeared at the top of the landing, her face a mask of pale terror. She didn't ask questions. She simply grabbed Mina, who was rubbing her eyes in confusion, and vanished into the depths of the house. Do-yun turned back to the door just as a set of blinding high beams flooded the foyer through the transoms. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold rain immediately soaking through his shirt. 3 black SUVs sat idling in the driveway, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of deep-sea monsters. From the lead vehicle, a man stepped out, shielding himself with a sleek black umbrella. It was Lieutenant Kang. He was younger than Do-yun, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place against the rugged, decaying backdrop of the estate. He walked toward the porch with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, the look of a vulture that had finally found a carcass. "Do-yun," Kang called out, his voice smooth and dripping with mock respect. "The elders are concerned. You missed your check-in, you missed your delivery, and then we find you here at your little graveyard of memories." "The road was washed out. I decided to take a rest. My business is my own, Kang." "It stopped being your own when you picked up the Han girls," Kang said, his tone shifting to something sharper, more jagged. He took a step onto the first stair. "Ji-woo, we know about the ledger, Do-yun. We know what Tae-shik gave his daughter. Hand them over, and the elders might let you retire here in peace. Refuse, and I'll have the police here in 10 minutes to report a kidnapping by a mentally unstable veteran of the Syndicate." Kang reached into his pocket and pulled out a legal document, waving it in the damp air. "I've already filed the paperwork to have you declared incompetent. Your assets, this land, the Syndicate's trust, it all flows through me now. You're not a boss anymore, Do-yun. You're just a squatter in a dead woman's house." Do-yun didn't flinch. He looked past Kang at the men stepping out of the other vehicles, all of them armed, all of them waiting for the word. He realized the threat wasn't just physical, it was a total erasure of his life. If he fought, he was a criminal. If he surrendered, the girls were dead. "You always were too greedy, Kang," Do-yun said, his hand moving slowly toward the railing where his pistol was hidden. "You see a vulture's feast, but you forgot that this is a wolf's den." The tension in the air was a physical weight, a wire pulled so tight it was ready to snap. The war for the haven had officially moved from the shadows to the doorstep. The standoff didn't end in a hail of bullets, but in a display of the very thing Lieutenant Kang could never understand: true preparation. As Kang's men moved to encircle the porch, the darkness of the estate was suddenly pierced by the arrival of 2 more vehicles, not black SUVs, but the local police and a representative from the district's legal oversight committee. Do-yun hadn't just made a call for help. He had used the coordinates from the ledger to tip off the authorities to Kang's illegal shell companies an hour before they arrived. "You're right about the paperwork, Kang," Do-yun said, stepping into the light as the police began to disarm the Syndicate soldiers. "But I filed mine first. The elders won't be coming for me. They'll be coming for the man who was stealing from the northern docks. That would be you." As Kang was led away in handcuffs, his face twisted in a mask of silent rage. The heavy silence of the mountain returned. Do-yun didn't celebrate. He simply walked back into the house, where Ji-woo and Mina were emerging from the cellar, their eyes wide with the realization that the storm had finally passed. 5 years later, the haven was no longer a graveyard. The peeling paint had been replaced by a warm, honey-colored stain, and the workshop in the back, once filled with the ghosts of the past, hummed with the sound of saws and the smell of fresh cedar. Do-yun sat on the porch, his rugged face softened by the afternoon sun, watching Mina run through the tall grass, while Ji-yu, now a confident young woman, managed the estate's books with the same precision her father once had. When Do-yun passed away peacefully in his sleep that winter, he didn't leave behind a criminal empire or a mountain of blood money. He left a legacy of a different kind. On the workbench in the center of the shop, Ji-yu found his old heavy metal toolbox. When she opened it, she didn't find tools or ledgers. It was empty, save for a small handwritten note in Do-yun's jagged script. The tools are gone because you've already built the house. Now, live in it.
The story of the boss and the sisters became a whisper in the underworld, a legend about a man who decided to hit the brakes when the world told him to accelerate. It was a final lesson in the true meaning of power. Real wealth wasn't found in the territory he had defended or the enemies he had crushed, but in the shared dinners, the noise of the workshop, and the laughter of children filling a house that was no longer empty. Do-yun had saved the girls from the rain, but in the end, they were the ones who had pulled him out of the storm for good. Family wasn't defined by the blood on your hands, but by the hands you chose to hold when the world went dark. Thank you for watching Syndicate Boss Files. Park Do-yun's story shows how one small choice to help can change a life, including yours. If this touched you, comment loyalty and share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe for stories that stay with you. And remember, when you see someone walking in the rain, don't rush past. They might be carrying the miracle you've been waiting for.